first reading is from Genesis, the 45th chapter. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Send everyone away from me." So no one was with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in these lands these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall settle in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, as well as your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. I will provide for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty.' And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. And after that his brothers talked with him, the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
This morning I will be actually preaching on our first lesson from Genesis 45. So our Genesis story, our story about Joseph, it has a deceptively happy glow to it. At least that's a unique presentation of it. However, the opening verse that says, "So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brother," that sentence holds a multitude of emotions and undergirds the ragged road we call life. Joseph is so overcome by the presence of his brothers that he needs to send everyone else away. And then, once he's alone with them, he begins to weep desperately. And that moment is paradoxically filled with joy and sorrow, with loss and with gain. Now, the reason I point this out is because our lectionary would have us start at verse 3, where Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. But without verses 1 and 2, we could assume that Joseph has forgotten the pain, has easily reconciled the past, and is just ready to move on. Because often this reading from Genesis is touted as one of the Bible's most vivid dramatizations of mercy and forgiveness. But this isn't just a story of easy assurances. Joseph's life is filled with shades of gray. Darkness and light intermingle every corner of his life. There's the darkness of his brother's hate, the darkness of Joseph being sold into slavery and then confined to prison, the darkness of Jacob's family situation as famine struck and he sends his sons, Joseph's brothers, in search of food, and then maybe even the darkness of Joseph's manipulation of his desperate brothers once they arrive in front of him, which is the point where we see Joseph and his brothers in this story. And all of these color this remarkable reunion we have before us today. The pain of yesterday sears deeply, and yet the promise of tomorrow kindles hope. Joseph may now be able to quip, "What you intended for evil, God intended for good," when he has the upper hand, power over his brothers, and things are on an upswing for him. But what about all the years upon years when Joseph is seemingly abandoned by God? The typical presentation of this story is, all things work together for good. Forgive as Joseph forgave. God's plan is greater than our plans. Which is a nice, neat, happy ending, but is tiresome, off-putting, and ultimately adds more pain when people are traversing in the dark. The truth is, many endings for many people are not yet happy, and maybe they never will be. Joseph's background matters because the most honest place to enter the story of Joseph is to recognize that he was wronged. On so many levels, he got the shaft. I mean, what exactly was the hand of God doing when his brothers threw him down the well? Where was the providence of God when Joseph was framed for rape? How can the lies and loss be part of God's plan? Now, it's true that Joseph found some reconciliation, but it didn't erase the past or the pain for him, and we shouldn't pretend like it does. Additionally, if we broaden our focus a bit, what was the hand of God doing for those 400 years when Joseph's ancestors, God's people, were in slavery, oppressed under Pharaoh? I mean, that is 20 generations of people left in the darkness, in the unspoken, uncharted territory of suffering, and the deep sense of purposelessness that haunts that path. I believe that there is some benefit in saying out loud that sometimes we feel like we are part of those 20 generations wandering in the dark, looking for the promised land, and God is nowhere to be found. Wounded, exhausted, pain-ravaged people are everywhere, every day stumbling all around us. And I wouldn't blame Joseph or those 20 generations of people, or those who live in domestic violence shelters, or families sitting in oncology wards, or those filing bankruptcy and foreclosures, or those in the middle of divorce, or those who have kids who are being bullied at school, or those who sleep homeless outside, or those with hearts that have been split down the middle, or even just those for whom life just hasn't added up the way they planned. I wouldn't blame those people if they were angry at God. Maybe it was easy for Joseph to welcome his brothers with open arms and to forgive as God forgives, and forgive God for every pit that Joseph ended up in. I don't know. But I do know that if I was in that position, I would be afraid. Afraid of being abandoned again, afraid of losing it all again, afraid of trusting again, afraid of loving again. And I would be angry. Angry at everything and angry at nothing. And mostly angry at God. I'm pretty sure that's not how life should be. Somehow, in the midst of all of this, God ends up feeling more like a foe than a friend. And I can't help but hear the whole love your enemies, bless those who curse you in a different light. And I'm aware that some of that sounds blasphemous, but I also feel like that's like basically par for the course with theologians. I recently read something written by a brilliant theologian who writes a lot of books and does speaking tours and is basically way more intelligent than I am. And he says that some sermons can be soul-sucking because they talk too much about Jesus, which makes me laugh and also makes me feel like I'm in good company. But his point isn't that there's something wrong with Jesus. His point is that too often we don't address how painful it can to just be a human. And we end up Jesusifying everything, just brushing it off and saying that Jesus will make it okay. How do I reconcile my fear? How do I forgive God? How do I make friends with my enemy, whoever that may be? Now here's the thing about these queries. I am acutely aware that I have painted myself into a corner. Because I know that I don't have the answers to all these questions. And I don't have the answers to all the questions that get asked of me. In painful times, I end up saying far more often than I'd like, I don't have an answer for that. However, I think that not asking the questions is far more detrimental to faith than not having the answers. I believe that by asking the hard questions, it forces some type of attempt to make sense of things, to make sense of faith, to make sense of God. It is only because I am desperate for God that I can be angry with God. It's only because God promises that perfect love casts out all fear that I can presume to expect release from my fears. And it is only because Jesus says that I should befriend my enemies that my heart is conflicted with confusion. So I think it's fair to quarrel with God by inquiring, since you said these words, how is it possible that certain things happen? Life just doesn't make any sense. And yet, paradoxically, we know that life itself, the essence of life, doesn't make any sense. You know what I mean? Like, it seems in life's nature that lives and hearts get broken. Those are people we love, those are people that we may never know, and sometimes even our very own. One of the reasons that we find making sense of God in life so perplexing is that we are part of what we are trying to understand. We are so deep in it. And as I think about Joseph's story, I'm struck by how the moments of comfort and succor were few and far between. And when those moments did arrive, they were often delivered by ugly messengers, slave owners and prison guards and demanding kings and a band of brothers who hated him. And all I can think is, why does grace and love and God come in such ugly packages? Which is another question I don't have the answers to. But I only need to look to the cross to be reminded of how ugly and painful the resurrection process is. And so I think that a faithful life, one that is committed to God, one that honors others, and one that preserves our souls, is mostly being willing to stagger from one safe enough place to another, trusting that some solace, some peace, or some promise will be found there. Because it seems true that despite my fears, my anger, and my questioning, despite the fact that I often turn God into the enemy, God still reconciles God's self to me, still forgives me, still calls me his child, still staggers through life with me, and with all of you. There is this point that we don't have in the Genesis story presented to us today, but there is this point in Joseph's story when his brothers strip him of his coat and cover him in the blood of goat as evidence of his death. I am sure you probably know this. There's this whole musical written about it, about his Technicolor dream coat. Right? No, it's just a coat. But really, this point is the beginning of the darkness for Joseph. Because from this moment on, he is stripped of everything. Everything but his life. And it is a terrible moment, followed by more and more terrible moments. And yet Joseph, by his sheer courage and belief, keeps rebuilding his life, despite every obstacle in his path. And so when he weeps terribly when he sees his brothers, he's weeping because his life has been resurrected. It's not the same as it used to be, but it is a new life. And it's also scandalous when anyone is stripped of everything. And it is almost impossible to reconcile. And yet, when the courage to face fears is found, when the audacity to believe despite it all is proclaimed, and the tenacity to start again is mustered, those are constant reminders that the resurrection takes place in this time and day. In the quicksand of life, sometimes you're lucky enough to hear a faint alleluia rising from those who weep. And sometimes, if we watch, we will see the hand of God putting the stars back into the skies one by one. And sometimes, we will feel the weight of a cloak being wrapped around our shoulders, and we don't feel so naked anymore.